My name's Aaron. I'm an alcoholic. Sobriety date is January 24th, 2007. I have a home group. This can be Saturday breakfast meeting. We meet and eat at Los Dos Agaves, 9 a.m. on Saturdays. And if you show up down there, I'll buy you breakfast. If I'm there on a Saturday, I wasn't there this morning. But I have a sponsor who knows he's my sponsor, which is important in Alcoholics Anonymous. I hold an active service position, and I've done that since about 90 days into my membership of Alcoholics Anonymous. I work with other men in the program. I work this 12 steps on a regular basis. And that's what keeps me sober and sane and in the middle of Alcoholics Anonymous. I need all of those things, and it's important. And first off, I want to welcome anybody. There was a lot of newcomers up here with less than a year, and especially the two people with the Adam, and I didn't hear the lady's name with the 24 hours. I want to welcome you to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I hope you, most importantly, not only hear something that keeps you coming back from me or Luis tonight, but I hope you feel something that makes you come back to Alcoholics Anonymous, because that was my experience at the end, So, and welcome to Luis's wife. I know that had to be a tough dynamic there. I know when I was going through the stages of my worst, the worst nightmare would have been having my wife sitting in the front row. So kudos to both of you guys. My girlfriend, I brought her up here. She listened to me 5 hours on the way up, so she's back at the hotel probably cutting her ears off for the ride home. So, so I want to thank Gordy for inviting me up here and reading. He gave me about an extra 5 minutes by reading how it works as fast as he did. That was like, for you older people, that was like Ted Nugent doing Wango Tango, I swear to God. So, and Joe, thank you for putting this meeting together. I know he started it with a friend of mine way back when. I think I spoke here in 2016 or 2017. Joe doesn't remember me, so it must have been a hell of a talk. So, strap in tonight, get ready, very memorable. So I just want to start out a little bit about how I grew up. I grew up in a tiny little town, Eddyville, Oregon. If you don't know where Eddyville is, nobody in Oregon does either. It's just a tiny little town between Corvallis and Newport on the coastal highway. On Highway 20, and I grew up with a lot of people that worked in the woods, a lot of loggers, a lot of tree planters, a lot of reforestation contractors. My dad was a reforestation contractor, and both him and my mom were functioning alcoholics. They drank daily. My grandpa drank daily. There was a lot of extracurricular, stuff that you don't mention in Alcoholics Anonymous. People call them, outside issues. I call them drugs. A lot of drugs in the household. A lot of it is legal now. A lot of it is still illegal. But that was just the norm for me. And it was never talked about. There was never secretive, like, don't go to school and talk about this, Aaron. It was just kind of an outlaw lifestyle. A buddy of mine always says about where we grew up, it was like Dukes of Hazzard on speed. And that's kind of what it was like, And my dad, I grew up on a huge chunk of property, but I grew up, there was no hot water where I grew up. My dad had taken this old mining house and turned it into a house, and it was about as backwoods as you could get. Every season was hunting season, if that tells you anything. I just grew up, it was, lawless, and there was no police officers in my town. I think I said I graduated with 19 kids in my class, pretty much the same 19 that I started school with. So total country boy through and through. A lot of drinking, and it just part of the culture, So I didn't start drinking on a regular basis till I was about 15 years old. And I'll tell you, I'm one of those guys that didn't say, hey, I drank because of my feelings, or I didn't feel part of it. I drank from the time I drank, like the big book says, because I loved the effect produced by alcohol. And it turned me into a maniac, and I loved it, right? It was like I lived my life all of a sudden 120 miles an hour, and I would drink till I fell flat on my face. And I'd do it again. And, early on, that was the weekends. I still went to school. I'm a kid that never got suspended from high school, small school. I got along with everybody, got along with my teachers, kicked out of class for talking a lot. But that was about it, not a lot of major trouble. So I graduated 17 years old. My first job was I I just did a summer of fighting wildfires, and then I went straight into high lead logging. And you guys know about logging out here. You know, if I'm out in the Midwest, they have no idea. They're thinking, you know, these tiny, you know, you guys know about high lead logging, and what goes along with it is a lot of drinking. You know, once again, part of the culture. We'd get off work, and it doesn't matter how old I am, I'm having beer when we get off work. I'm sitting on the back of the crew cab, we're having beer. They don't care. I drive home drunk, and it just started. You know, I just, like I said, drank alcoholically. I moved over to the big town of Philomath after I graduated. That was about 4,000 or 5,000 people. They had police officers there. The acceleration of my drinking just got into where, you know, I started making a lot of bad decisions, got in trouble with the law right away. And yeah, that was just the progression of my life. You know, my first DUI, I was 18 years old, and that's where I was first introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I remember the meeting like it was yesterday. You know, I walked into it was one of those small town meetings, about 10 people in there. The average age was dead, right? But no, it was fairly young, right? There was an older lady in there. I remember she was like 40 at the time, and they're going around and they're talking about serenity. I have no idea what they're talking about. All I know is when it got to her, she said, my idea of serenity is I stay home on a Friday night and I pet my cat. And I'm like, we are in two totally different spots in our life right now. Now looking back, I'm like, hey, she might have been hitting on me. I might have missed something totally different, right? I might have just missed the mark. I might have been sober from the age of 18, if you know what I'm talking about. But it just didn't stick right there, right? So I got into, you know, I just kept drinking alcoholically. And that means when I ingest alcohol, the big book talks about it, I get thirsty again and I just can't stop, right? And I didn't want to stop. Early on, I just didn't. Consequences, I always say it, when I was in my late teens, 20s, were not in my vocabulary. They just weren't. And so I was married, divorced, had a son by the age of 19, and basically walked out on my family, you know, and I could relate a lot to what Luis talked about up here. In fact, part of my story, he'll probably think I'm stealing from him, but it's we're right on the same level of the way I lived, you know. I turned my back on my family, I turned my back on my son, and I just did, you know, what the big book said. You know, I'm selfish, self-centered to the core. I don't care how it affects anybody else. I think it's all about me, that I'm only going to hurt myself. But it's not, you know, it's tearing up everything around me, you know, breaking my mom's heart. I started going in and out of jail. I worked work release for a while. They would send somebody by in the crew cab to pick me, because I was a good worker when I was sober, right? So I'm locked up in jail. They'd send the crew cab by the county jail, which is weird, speaking right on the other side of a police station. I never thought this would happen 16 years ago. In fact, if you would have told me a week ago, I wouldn't have believed you. But they'd send somebody by the jail. They'd pack me a sack lunch, and I'd go out and work all day, and I'd come back, and they would do my laundry and then wake me up in the morning with my lunch. And I'm like, this is better than being married, right? I'm like, I don't have the hassle of it. You know, I'm just having a good time. I go out, work, I'm making money. I'm not spending it anywhere. And that was kind of my mentality. Just, it never quite matched with anybody else's reality. It just didn't. I was crazy, you know. And I like to talk about, you know, music a lot in my story. That is where I connect with my spirituality. And I remember they had an interview with Johnny Cash one time, and they said, you know, how crazy were you, Johnny? And he said, I was crazy as you can get. And that's how I felt about my life. Looking back on it, I was just insanity. So I started doing a lot of time in and out of jail. That doesn't make me an alcoholic. Like I said, my alcoholism is I start drinking, I can't stop. Once I start drinking, I make a lot of bad decisions. Like I say, you know, my alcohol started as my first demon, and it was my last demon. And in between, there was a lot of other stuff, a lot of other bad decisions, a lot of things that happened. And by the age of 24, I was in prison in Oregon. And that kind of happened kind of happened because of me. I'd gone through, I had a suspended sentence. I'd finished up a huge chunk of treatment or jail time, went into treatment. They let me out. I get out of there, and you give me a lie detector test as I'm leaving treatment, right? And I'm telling people, hey, Joe, I'll be back for your graduation next week, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to stay sober. And within 24 hours, I'm out there seeing the girl that I'm not supposed to be seeing, and I'm getting loaded and I'm drinking, and I have a 19 to 24 month prison sentence hanging over my head. 3 months later, I get in a bar fight. The cops come in, and I know right then, that's it. I'm going to prison. So at that point, my dad came in. He asked the judge if anybody could, if he could speak on my behalf, and there was nobody. I mean, at that point in my life, not saying I didn't have friends in my corner, but they're sure as hell not going to show up at the courthouse to support me, right? And so my dad says, hey, can I speak on his behalf? And, my attorney, more than happy to have somebody speak on my behalf. What my dad does is he gets up before the judge and he says, this is my son, Aaron. He's becoming institutionalized. He's a danger to himself, and he's a danger to society, and I think you need to give him the maximum amount of prison that you can give him. And that was my father, and that's funny now, not so funny then. I got to grab it. So that was my trip. So that was my journey into the prison system. Excuse me, this is a long jaunt over here. So I go in there, and once again, that was all behind my decisions based behind alcohol. Like I said, it doesn't, and we don't have to go to this length. We just don't. If you're new here and, you're coming in on a DUI or whatever, plenty of people stay sober like that. That's just not my experience. When I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, the doctor's opinion, and I was reading through it again today, it's like, frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices, right? I had to hear a story of depth and weight. And that was me. I just had to hear somebody that had built it up and burned it down, And I always tell the new guys, if you're sitting in here tonight, I hope you've burned your life down to the ground and you're so miserable that you might give this thing an honest shot, because that's what happened to me. I had to burn it exactly to the ground, flat, where I could go, okay, I'm going to surrender now. And I'm not going to do something different. I got to do something to save my own life, right? So, short story about how I went through the prison system. I got in. I was able to get into the boot camp program at that time, which cut some time off my sentence. It was 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. We had cognitive restructuring. We had physical training, drug and alcohol classes, work on the outside, and it was ran just like the military. 2-minute showers. We sat in there. We had to request permission to speak, to go to the bathroom. The whole it was just like that. And as a lot of alcoholics, if we're disciplined, I do all right. And I'm in there and I'm disciplined, and I start thinking I'm getting, I feel better. I'm getting healthier. I got sobriety behind me. And so from there, still my best thinking is I write a letter to my aunt. And I said, I need to get out of the area I was in, which at that time was Benton County, where Oregon State University is. And I just become so well known to the system there. I'm like, I got to get out. I want to get away from the drugs and alcohol. Can I move up with you to Portland? And that was my best thinking, right? So not the best place to get away from the drugs and alcohol. So I moved up with her. She said 3 months. I get up, I start going to school, and I want to be a police officer because I'm delusional, right? I get out of prison, and I'm going to go to school, and I'm going to be a cop now because I know what it's like living on the other side. And I end up I work with my aunt for a little bit. She has a Christmas party. They bring out the booze. I'm like, okay, microbrews, right? That was different. I was weaned on Olympia beer and hams. Maybe this will have a different effect. And that became the story of my life, and I take a drink, and sure enough, it's got alcohol in it, and the same effect. The thing is, I'd moved away from a lot of the stuff that kind of accelerated I can't say I totally moved away from it. I can say I moved away from a lot of the criminal behavior. And so that started up, in and out, and I would try to quit drinking. I always thought the other stuff was the problem, but my deal is as soon as I drink, I want to find something else. My sponsor puts it as simply as this. I drink, I get sleepy, I want to wake up. I wake up too much, I drink something else, I get too sleepy. And it was this constant chemistry, right? And I failed every single experiment that I've ever done. And so from there, So 3.5 years later, I'm still working on that 2-year degree at my aunt's house, who I was supposed to stay for 3 months, right? And she and my uncle was a local legend basically guitarist. So it wasn't like I was living in a house that was free of alcohol or anything else. It was like I'd go out to the bars with them and all this stuff. But she just saw that I wasn't, I was basically just treading water at this time with my alcoholism. And it made it a little less obvious because they were doing a lot of drinking too. So, but she said, after 3.5 years, she said, Aaron, I wasn't working. I was flunking out of school. And she said, we've done everything we can to help you here. You're going to have to move on. And I start start putting in job applications. Here I was a high lead logger. And I can't get they told me in boot camp if I marked no on the application when it came to the criminal background, or if I marked yes on the application, just get in there and explain it to them what the criminal background was. Well, it was my experience. This isn't everybody's. My experience was I felt like my applications were just going in the trash can, right? And so I had a friend of mine that I used to run around with doing all our stuff, and he had kind of cleaned up his act, and he worked for a major distribution center, union, Teamsters, and he said, come out here, just mark no on the application. He goes, they're real lenient, and I think you can get through. And sure enough, they obviously weren't checking any of the applications, because sure enough, I got in there, he vouched for me, and I get in there, and I'd cleaned up a little bit at that time. And, I talk about this because I start going through like, okay, these are becoming problems, right? And the big book would talk about it, one more attempt, one more failure. And I'd bounce around, I'd try some AA meetings here and there and feel better, get a couple, 3 weeks, a month behind me and fall on my face. And what happened is I go to work for this company. There's 3 bars across the street. We work swing shift. I get out at 12:30 in the morning, and you know the story. I go over there. 80%, 90% of those guys can go and have a drink, 2 drinks, go home to their families, go home, make dinner, get up, take their kids to sporting events, whatever it is that they're doing, right? With me, like you, I take that drink, and I just don't know when it's going to end, right? I might end up at home that night. I might end up, most of the time, the party is just getting started. And those guys think I'm at home, hungover the next day, I can't make it to work. But for me, I'm still, it's still going, and I'm going till the wheels fall off. And that started creating a lot of issues at work, and it was a lenient attendance policy because of the union. So I had this whole, without getting into it, I had this whole thing where I'd work off my attendance, go back. I could call in sick 3-4 days at a time. It counted as one occurrence. So it was like an alcoholic's dream, right? So, but it just got to the point where I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that was probably 2001. And I always said, when I was done, right, when I was done having fun with this stuff, that I just put the plug in the jug. It was okay. And it was getting to that point. I'm just done. I realized the alcohol is a problem. And the deal is when I was ready to put that plug in the jug, I'd overshot the mark, and I don't even know, the big book talks about the problem drinker where if, consequences are bad enough, maybe, my wife leaves me or I got a DUI, some people can just quit. And I overshot that mark when I was way past that mark. If there was ever a point in my life where that might have been true, I blew right past it because I didn't want to stop. In those younger years, I loved the chaos. I loved the craziness. And so by this time, I want to quit, and then alcohol has its hooks in me. And so I go in finally, after missing so much work and stuff, and this is the first time that I went in for help to the general manager, and I brought in all my attendants every time I'd been written up, and I said, here's the deal, I have a serious drinking problem, and I need some help. And they opened up the door for help for me, and that was the first time that I'd ever asked for help. That was 2001. They let me do an outpatient program, did the UAs. I clean up, I sober up. A lot of us, I'm one of them, can become a really good worker. So I go in, of course I have all my other issues behind me, but I go in and I show up and I'm working overtime, and I put some months together. During that time, there was a beautiful young lady by the name of Megan. Of course, I worked in a warehouse, a distribution center with 300 men. There was about 5 women. I always say, any woman that walks through there, it's like walking through a prison. They're all beautiful, right? Doesn't matter but there was a beautiful young lady. I always say she really did, from the day I met her, had this just angelic look to her, right? The long blonde hair and the pale skin. And we started talking, and she met me when I was sober, right? A lot of us piece ourselves together pretty well, put ourselves together real well when we're sober. And she asked me out, long story short, I went out with her a couple times, and I knew things were, kind of, going in a direction of, where we would be dating on a regular basis. And I told her, here's the deal. If this goes on, if I ever start drinking, I've got a serious problem. And if I ever start drinking, you're going to have to leave me, right? And she, a normal person, that's not a normal conversation to have to begin with, right? And so I think I left her more puzzled than anything. And she hadn't seen me drink, she didn't know what it was like. Her dad, he worked at the warehouse at the other end, graveyard. I didn't know him. My reputation had preceded me. He had told everybody down at his end, nobody's to date my daughter. I didn't get the memo down on my end. Immediately, I was not like, and this guy at that time, he looked like a damn bulldog, the shaved head, the long goatee, and I would pass his crew coming into work, and I would just get the death stare. And Megan kept dating me, and I was sober. He wouldn't meet me for months, and finally I go to meet him. He basically asked me to come over to the house. His wife said, hey, you're going to lose this battle, so either you meet this guy or you're going to lose your daughter because she's in love with him. So I go over there, sat through a very long, quiet dinner, and we were going to go out to the movies after that. She said, hey, Dad, if you want to talk to Aaron, you better do it because we got to get going. So basically, he summoned me in the next room, and his conversation started out like this. Aaron, he goes, these are the 3 things that I do not like about you. And it was all downhill from there. And it wrapped up with, that's my little girl out there. And he goes, if you ever do anything to her or any one of my kids to hurt them, he goes, I have no problem going to prison for any one of them. And I knew he meant it, right? I knew he meant it. So the deal is, we dated, had a successful another 2-3 months, and I go to visit a buddy of mine in South Dakota back in Rapid City, and I don't know how to drink. I don't know how to have fun without that alcohol. And I remember we go to a bar, and he's like, you don't have to do this, right? But in my head, right, the great obsession, I'm going to have that drink. And it doesn't matter if it sits in front of me for 2 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 days, right? Once that obsession kicks in, I'm going to drink. I'm not leaving until I have that drink. And that's what happened. I drank, and I wake up in a blackout on my buddy's couch, have no idea how I got there. And that's what would happen today if I drank, and I just know that's just the way it is. And so to speed through the next, 5 years, alcohol, it was one more attempt, one more failure, one more attempt, one more failure. Megan and she kind of pulled me along by my bootstrings. And she, when I met her, I was the back room at my brother's house, 29 years old. She says, well, don't you want to get your own apartment? I thought, God, is that even possible, right? It's like I had no idea about real life. And so she kind of brought me along, and her father reluctantly, he tolerated me. I'll say that, he would tolerate me at family get-togethers. And I would try to pull myself together. Most of the time I failed. So like I said, another DUI, more drinking. What happened with my wife is she was the first one that checked into, my girlfriend at the time, first one to check into Al-Anon. And, God bless any Al-Anons out here. She checked in, and what she could do to help me out or live with me because she loved me. She loved me when I was sober. And I just put her through, she was the first one to say, hey, don't you want to have a relationship with your son? He was like 11 or 12 years old at this time. And I showed up, like I'd say, in photo ops. You'd see me, you go through an old photo album, oh, God, your dad was here at Christmas or your birthday. Most of them are missing, right? There was Christmas, I told him I was going to show up, and I start drinking the night before. I'm going to go out, and I'm going to buy him a bunch of gifts. And to celebrate, I'm going to tip back a couple beers. And I just don't show up. My dad would promise him, hey, your dad's going to be down here this year. And he said your son would be, 6 or 7 years old and walking around the corner to see if I was going to be there to surprise him. And I just wasn't. And so she helped me repair that relationship. And, like I said, it was just in and out of sobriety, and I just couldn't get a hold on it. And so 2006, we got married, like I said, she loved the person I was when I was sober, and she loved me with all her heart. So 2006, we got married. We'd actually moved my son up. He is having some issues with his mom. And and that was the worst year of my drinking, minus all the the jails, prison, all that stuff, because it had just become, my brother said I drank to be free. And by drinking, I created my own prison. And that's how it was. It just became dark. The fun was gone, and I drank to maintain. There was times, I'm not proud of it. I would beg, my wife to go up and get me booze so I could get out of bed to maybe make it to work, or just even out enough so I could go out and get more booze, right? And it was just sick. And then I tried to piece together some sobriety for my son, and it was just a dark time, So January 1st, 2007, like Louisa was saying, I sat down and I wrote what was a New Year's resolution. At the very top of it, I said, do not drink. And under that, be a better father, be a better son, be a better friend, be a better husband. And that's all, I just wanted to be a better man. And I knew all of that fell in behind don't drink. That took me to January 5th on my own, I'm going to quit drinking one more time. January 5th, I go to downtown Portland, take my son down there for a concert, and I get a DUI with my 16-year-old son in the car. I want to be a better father 5 days ago, right? Do not drink 5 days ago. And that's, incomprehensible demoralization. My brother-in-law was a Portland police officer. He sent one cop back there and he said, yeah, that's my brother-in-law out there. And her back there, and he said he's got a serious drinking problem and he needs a lot of help. And I remember them taking my son off in another police car and him crying, and it was just a miserable. I tried to outrun the cops. I got my son's watching the back window. It's just like Father of the Year, right? 5 days ago, I just want to be a better father. 5 days later, I'm feeding my son alcohol and helping, having him help me try to scoot away from the cops. And that's the way I drink, and that's the way I drink today. I wanted to have one beer, and that's lit the fuse. So incomprehensible demoralization 5 days later, or 2 weeks later, for whatever reason, I don't know if they do it in Washington, they give you your license back in Oregon for 30 days, hoping you get another DUI, I guess. I have no idea why they would do that. So 2 weeks later, I'm driving home from work, and once again, I'm going to, 20 years of drinking, I can't figure it out, right? The big book talks about it. I swing in for one more beer. The big book says, you ask an alcoholic 100 times why he takes that next drink. 100 times he's going to give you, he's going to give you 100 different answers. Once in a while, it's the right one. I don't know any more than you do. And once again, I pick up one beer. It's a 24-ouncer, but I pick up one beer. I don't pick up a case. I don't pick up 2 cases. I pick up one beer. And by the time I make it home, I'm going to the store to get another one, and then I'm getting more, more booze. And it always starts like that. So to speed this up, you guys get the idea. I'm an alcoholic, right? And it was miserable. And for the next 5 days, I'm in and out of blackouts. Her parents show up, try to get me to go to work. I'm on the verge of losing my job, missed 30-plus days of work the year before, and I'm just hanging on by a thread. And they come over, and they're cooking me food, and they're doing it for their daughter, cooking me food, giving me coffee. I'm sneaking in the back, taking pulls off the whiskey, just trying to outlast them, right? It was like Bill and Ebby. I thought, my whiskey's going to outlast their lectures, what they're doing. And sure enough, finally I said, I promise you I'll go to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. Basically, if you get out of here, and they left, and I remember peeking through the blinds, and I remember my father-in-law just looking down with just like the look of a father who had been beaten. He wanted to do the right thing by his daughter. And I remember my mother-in-law looking back and with just a look of disgust on her face. And I couldn't wait for them to get out of there fast enough so I could head down to the store and get more booze, And in another couple of days, my wife had taken the cars, and I called her up, and that was January 23rd, 2007, and I called her up and I said, can you come home? And so we can talk. And she came home, and I'm like, I need to talk about this drinking problem that I've got, like it wasn't obvious enough, right? And I'm trying to feed her beers, right? She's a normie. She doesn't drink, doesn't do drugs. Here, drink some beers with me. Let's talk about my drinking problem. And so she doesn't. I finish off the beer, but what I did that night was, it was for the first time in my life, I think I was 100% defeated and honest, and I just broke down and I said, I can't do this and I need some help. And she went to sleep that night, and I wrote a note. I stayed up, finished all the beer, and I wrote her a note, and I said, Megan, I love you, and I'm sorry for letting you down, and I'm sorry for letting your family down. And if you stay home with me today, I'll go to some meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous with you. And so I come to the next day at about 10:30. She's gone because she's a productive member of society. And but what I did differently that day is there's a meeting, noon meeting, Free to Be Me in Oregon City, and that was about a 12-mile drive for me, and I drove in there, and I walked up those 3 steps, and I drive by that old crusty shack sometimes where they don't have the meeting anymore, and I walked up those 3 steps, and my life changed, and I walked into that door, and people welcomed me, and I felt a warmth in there that I hadn't felt in Alcoholics Anonymous before. But most importantly, it wasn't a check-in meeting. It wasn't like, I'm doing good today, blah, 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 this is what's going on. What somebody did is they read out of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I feel like looking back on that, where God makes, creates a plan, what they did was they read, but what about the real alcoholic? And I'll summarize here. Here's a guy that's been puzzling you. He builds his life up and he tears it down. And he's more or less, he's a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. More or less insanely drunk all the time. He hides liquor all over the house if he can afford it. And they were talking to me, right? And I just remember just hearing that. And I'm like, I've got to read that book. And I'd probably had him before in treatment. I buy 2 books. I make my first act of amends on the way home because I got to drive literally right by Megan's parents' house, and I stop in there, and I haven't even cracked the book yet. And I walk in and I hand her mom a big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm really sorry for what's been going on with your daughter, and if you read this, you'll probably figure out why I've done that, right? The Al-Anon. And so I hadn't even made it home. So about 5 more miles I get home, and what I did differently as I dug through there, and luckily somebody didn't say, hey, on page, this is the page. I didn't ask. And I started reading there from the beginning, and I read, and I read, and I read, and I found that section, and I read, and I read, and I found myself on every page in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's when my life shifted, and that's when my life changed. And I'm going to be that guy that sits over here. My brother said my obsession was like a hamster on a squeaky wheel. When I got a drink in my head, I was going to drink. I drink no matter what. I just drank, good day, bad day, it doesn't matter what it is. And from that day, January 24, 2007, when I walked into that room, and I know this isn't everybody's experience, but that obsession stopped. And I believe, God had a plan for me from there on out, whatever it was. I'd done enough destruction in my life. And my son at 18 months sober, I remember showing him my coin, and I said, can you believe that I have 18 months? And he said, Dad, he goes, I can't believe how different you looked that first day you came home from AA. And he had seen a shift, the sunlight, right? The sunlight of the Spirit had come through me. I believed that. And so I kept going back, kept reading the book, and I kept going back to that noon meeting every day because you guys, you've given me some hope in there, some sunshine, some sunlight. And I remember part of that meeting was, if you're new, I became accountable for once. I didn't sit in the back and I didn't scoot out the door. And they would say, is there anybody here in their first 30 days of sobriety? Every single day. And I would raise my hand and say, my name's Aaron, I'm an alcoholic. Every single day. And I thought, God, they probably think I'm drinking every night, right? And it was like the longest 30 days ever. So I'm raising my hand. And but people were great. I remember a guy coming across, introducing himself, giving me his phone number, the first time I ever used a number that was given to me. And I flipped through the book, the meeting schedule, and I'm like loving this AA. You guys are giving me a lot of hope. I hear laughter in there. And I find the Canby Saturday breakfast meeting. This was literally my thought. I thought, okay, all these people can afford breakfast, so they're probably doing better than I am right now. And so I go into that room, and it was like here tonight. There was an electricity in there. I walked in. There was a guy I'd met from the noon meeting. He was one of the first ones in there. His deal was, he's passed on now, but he would say, his name's Steve Little, and he'd say, his deal was he could remember, this is before smartphones or anything, but he would remember every single person's name because somebody did that for him when he was new, and it hit him in the heart. So his sponsor told him, then do that for other people, and he could. It was like, so I walk into that meeting, and he says, hey, Aaron, welcome, and somebody knows me. right? And that meeting lit up with an electricity, and it's the same thing today. I say it's electric. There's laughter in there, and it drew me into Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's what I needed. I didn't need that. I thought Alcoholics Anonymous was a program of whining and crying, and if you're new here tonight and that's what you think, you know, I haven't been bored since the day that I walked into Alcoholics Anonymous. I have more fun and I laugh harder with people in here than I ever have in my life. And I've got a buddy, Mongo, that always says, you know, and if you're bored in Alcoholics Anonymous, you might just be a boring person. And I believe that because, you know, my calendar is like stacked with stuff to do. But that's what I found in there. It was there was a fellowship that I never knew existed. I thought people came in here, whined and cried an hour out of their day, and then went their separate ways, right? And these people are talking about going on cruises together and diving and climbing mountains and going to musical events and sporting events. And I thought, this is unlike anything I've ever heard. You know, that was the attraction for me. The hurdle was going to be, you know, and I'll get into. You know, I always say that the first second, the steps are 100% important if you're new here tonight. And my story, I want to bring the new person into this deal, and I want to express how important the steps are. I'm not going to get through all 12 of them tonight, but I always say by walking into that first meeting, I was so beat up that I'd been working on that first step for 20 years. I mean, and that's the honest to God truth. I knew my hurdle was going to be God, you know, and I heard people talk about God, and I believed that they believed it. That was the most important part. I could see it through them, but I knew it was a hurdle for me because I didn't grow up with a God in my household. My dad was what he'd call a born-again atheist. He's got a PhD, and he read the Bible twice and everything. That's all I knew about God, that there was fairy tales he didn't believe, right? So I knew that was going to be a hurdle. But I remained honest, and I remained willing and teachable, and that's the most important thing. And I thought, these people are onto something. And luckily enough, 3 weeks in, a guy by the name of Ron H., he's still a member of the breakfast meeting today, but he was sharing a birthday, and he talked about being in a drunk driving crash in 1988 where he was the driver, where a mother and her 2 children were killed. And he had done 8 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. And he became a member of Alcoholics Anonymous because somebody that had brought H&I in. And God bless anybody that does H&I, because I'm a direct result, not from sitting in the penitentiary, but as a result of somebody bringing a meeting in there and the guy getting out and bringing in that message to me. And somebody grabbed him after the meeting that was doing H&I, and they said, Ron, here's the deal. You can't unring the bell, but you never have to ring it again. And it just hit me in the heart, and that was enough. It just kicked whatever he said, and it was the feedback of the people that I knew it was real, right? He talked about a letter of forgiveness he had from the victim's family, and that just kicked the door wide open. You know, the big book of 12 and 12, they talk about, you know, God doesn't make too hard of terms for those who seek him, and I was ready. That was the sweat. You know, I came to believe that a power greater than myself would just restore me to sanity. And I go home and I'm digging through that book now, and I'm digging through and I'm finding a simple prayer in there: "Thy will, not mine, be done." And from what I hear in here the last several days, that prayers work better when you hit your knees. So I started hitting my knees, and "Thy will, not mine, be done." And I heard Ron's story on a Saturday. That was a Saturday, and so it was a Thursday night. That was my 29th day of sobriety. That Thursday night. And I remember the breakfast meeting gives you those nice heavy metal brass coins. Nothing against the plastic ones or anything else, but they, you know, when I came in there and I said, you know, I was new to sobriety, they gave me one of those. And I remember I'm in the warehouse, and I find a place. Now I know it's, you know, called meditation, you know, and I found a place quiet. It's a huge warehouse, and I pulled that out just after midnight, my 30th day, and I pulled that out, and I'm looking forward to going to the noon meeting the next day, and I reflect on my life. And if you're new here, man, your life can, you know, it accelerated in 30 days from when I walked in here, and I had this newfound a relationship with a higher power that I didn't even know existed 30 days ago. You guys had introduced me to that, and I was grateful, right? And I come home and I work a couple hours overtime, and I walk through the bedroom door. My wife's laying a little different, and I turn her over, and she's not breathing. And I call 911, and she's not breathing. And they tell me how to do CPR on her, and she's not breathing. And I'm yelling at them, get somebody here. And they said, is there anybody that we can call? I said, call her dad. And I gave him the phone number back when we could memorize phone. I've still got his number in my head to this day. I said, call her dad. And I live in a small town. And it felt like, they were probably there in 5 minutes, but it felt like 2 hours. And I sat there, and I stayed on the phone with 911. Those paramedics showed up. And they went in there, and they were back there less than a couple minutes, it felt like. They said, sir, can we speak to you in the other room? And I knew right then she was gone, right? 24 years old. Wasn't a drinker. Didn't do drugs. She had epilepsy. Something they always said wasn't life-threatening. She had a seizure in her sleep and passed away. And her dad showed up. And he pulled in. I said, he comes marching through the door. Like I said, he's not my biggest fan. And I said, Martin, she didn't make it. And he thought it was just a routine seizure, And he brushed past me, and the paramedics grabbed him. And he's a big man. And they grabbed him before he could go back into the bedroom because they knew he didn't want to see what he was going to see. And they told him that she was gone. And he just hit his knees. And he let out this sound. And what I heard that night was the sound of a father's heartbreak. And I never want to hear it again. And from there, she's got a twin sister. We had to go tell them, and they told us not to leave the house. And I remember this now, and going and telling her mom and coming back, and it's such a weird scene. And they have the ambulance there and the gurney there, and you walk in, and anybody that's been through this, it's so surreal. You have paramedics in the house, and you have police officers because they want to make sure nothing weird happened, and you have, the coroner there. And I remember the coroner coming out, and he said, and when I reflect that AA was there from the very beginning, he comes out and he said, I see there's some recovery books, a big book back there. And he said, were those hers? And I said, no, those are mine. And I know what he was doing now. He's making sure that she didn't commit suicide, because we lose so many people because they hit that darkness. And I'm so grateful that I hit the light right before all this went down. Because that night I missed the breakfast meeting, or I missed the noon meeting the next day for, everybody can understand that. And that was my 30th day. And that night, I remember sitting there, and I was so on fire for this thing. 29 days into 30, right? I'm so on fire for this thing, and I believe in this higher power. And I'm at that crossroads, right? Do I really believe what I did yesterday? Megan knows I was on my way. And I lean in instead of leaning out. And I decided, I hit my knees. And I said, thy will, not mine, be done. And I'm sleeping out on the bedroom floor Saturday morning, the very next morning, about 8 in the morning, and the front door opens. And every time I doubt a power greater than myself, I go back to this day. The front door opens, and it was her father, Martin, walked through, and he said, this is the last thing I promised my daughter, is to get you to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous this morning, and you're going to get up and you're going to go. And what had happened the night before she passed away, she found out she had to work overtime at the bank, and she said, hey, Dad, can you give Aaron a ride to this meeting? And that father, through all the devastation and the heartbreak, remembered what he had to do to get up at that specific time. And I'll tell you right now, I didn't want to go. I got up and I went with that man, and it was the breakfast meeting. And to this day, Martin will say that meeting surrounded us with a love and compassion that is unmatched. I remember they got Steve Little stood up and he said, this is Alcoholics Anonymous. When one of us hurts, we all hurt. And that hit me right in the heart, and that room surrounded us. And people, and thank God I went to a powerful meeting where people were working. When I look back on that day, everybody that stayed after there, right, stayed after for an hour, giving us phone number, all of them have died sober or are still sober today because they were working this 12-step of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they continued to do it. And they were part of a miracle that day, without a doubt. And that's where I collected my 30-day coin. My buddy Gary, who is one of my very best friends to this day, I didn't know from Adam. He gives me a hug. He says, keep coming back. At my 1 year, I thanked Ron for telling his story, and I said I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for you. And he said, if we were betting men, we would have bet you would have never came back after that day. And I know what he means now, because people come in and they go, and it's more of a shock when people stay here than when they go, And so it was under those circumstances, they would have just expected that I never came back. And I remember coming back that next week, and there was a lady there by the name of Avril, and she handed me a card, and she was waiting for me, and it was the footsteps in the sand. And I said, I'm sorry for your loss. And she waited there for me, and something in her told her that I was going to come back. And a week after that meeting, 37 days sober, we had to put together a memorial for a 24-year-old. And, it's hard to do that. You're dealing with a sudden death. And the only thing that I could get up and say was, I got to choose, unfortunately for Megan, the music for our wedding, and I'm a huge Johnny Cash fan, and I chose Walk the Line, right? And my uncle's there on guitar, and I said, you guys know, I'm sure most of you know the story of Walk the Line, and I said, this is a promise and a dedication to my wife, and it's Walk the Line, and he played that acoustically, and you guys have helped me keep that promise every day, one day at a time, for 16 years. And I can't thank you enough for that. You've given me a life beyond my wildest dreams, and I can't thank you enough for that. You've given me my family back. That man took me to that meeting every Saturday for the next 3 years. And I wasn't his number one son-in-law for sure. Not his number one. And he gave me an amends. He's been at every single one of my birthdays for 16 years. I've filled a seat at his Thanksgiving table and Christmas table every Christmas and Thanksgiving for the last 16 years. And you guys have given me that. A man that hated me, and he'll tell you that he hated me. Without a doubt, he loves telling people that he hated me, right? And so so that's the relationship we've built. To go into, that was my introduction. That's what happened. If you're new here, man, you can get through just about anything, with the prayer and the acceptance of that higher power piece. That's without a doubt what kept me here. And the fellowship was so very important to me early on. And so, to go on to the job, the court system, I had to do, I pled into a DUI intensive supervision program because they wanted to give me 90 days in jail. I would have lost my house, all of that. And I pled into that. They had lie detector tests, breathalyzer on my telephone, the whole 9 yards. And that all became so secondary to losing somebody like that I used the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I pushed through that, and I graduated. The first one to ever graduate that program early. It was after 2.5 years, and I was supposed to be in there for 3. During that time, I climbed to the top of Mount Hood, 11,300 feet, and I took some of Megan's ashes up there with me. And from up there, I stand on the top, and I make that trudge, and it's tough. And I remember looking out, and you can't tell where the earth ends and the sky begins, right? And I take those ashes, and I throw them to the wind. And I thank God and Alcoholics Anonymous. And from up there, I can feel that wind, and it's like God. I can't see it, but I can feel it, and I know He's there. And He's been with me every step of the way through the good times, the bad. I went 2.5, 3 years sober. I went that same job. I make it to foreman. They promote me to foreman. I make employee of the year. This is just, and I'm not saying this because you guys did all this. I was the guy that couldn't even make it out of bed. At 2010, they bring me in. It's a union job. You might want to bring a shop steward. I'm like, what have I been doing? Milking my brakes? I've literally been up there dozens of times. And they say, can you tell us the truth about your criminal background? And in 2009, I was terminated for falsifying my employment application in 1999. And that's a true story. And I battled that. I won't get into that whole thing. But battled it for 2 years. I lost. Irreparable breach of trust after that many years, right? And I went to work for an old boss of mine. He didn't want to hire me. He was looking for help around the Christmas season. He got a hold of my father-in-law. And my father-in-law said, Aaron's looking for work. you might want to hire. And he knew me from when I was party. He was one of my bosses where I worked. He said, I'm not going to hire that guy. And he said, I'm going to vouch for him. And that's what's happened with Alcoholics Anonymous. That's the same father-in-law that hated me, right? So he vouches for me. And he hired me for 2 weeks through the Christmas season. And I've been there for 14 years now. And I went for work for half the wages, and I worked my way up through the ranks, and I became part of management, and they've offered me a job cross country. I turned it down because my foundation's here. But that's all Alcoholics Anonymous, right? You guys have given me, I cannot take credit for anything that's happened in my life. I just can't. I got a great relationship with my son today. I've been there for the birth of my 2 grandchildren. My brother called me up August 1st, 2010, said he's trying to get a little Al-Anon on his part. He's getting loaded. He was the guy that'd feed me beers and pills over at the house, and he'd call up my dad when I left. Yeah, Aaron's over here all screwed up again, right? Something's really bad. So his wife, he calls me up and he said, hey, I need to get Natalie to a meeting. She's stealing my pills and drinking my booze, and I'm like, okay. So I flipped through the book, and I'm like, there's a meeting, 20 minutes from now at the 12 and 12 Club in Portland, right down from their house. So he takes her down there, and they hand him how it works, right? And this is why those readings are so important. They hand him how it works, and he makes it halfway through that reading, and he breaks down in tears, and it's like God punched him in the heart, right? And they've both been sober, and I'm not talking about just sober. They've been active in Alcoholics Anonymous since August 1st, 2010, and it's one of the biggest blessings that I've had. That's my only blood sibling, to have a blood sibling in Alcoholics Anonymous, and we tore it up together, right? And so that's been a blessing, as far as my amends, like I said, I've made amends with my son. I've made amends with my wife's family. I'm married and divorced in Alcoholics Anonymous. You guys got me through that. I had a beautiful relationship with a woman for 8 years. We went separate ways. Still great friends with her today. In fact, she was a nurse where my mom was in a care facility for several years. She had multiple sclerosis since I was a kid. So she was in that facility. I met Stevie, that was her name, as a CNA. She went on to become a nurse, and so I had to deal with her through that whole thing, and we were friends, right? My son's mom, I made amends to her. She invites me down for Father's Day get-together. That was the woman that said, I made her life a living hell, right? I've received so much that it will be impossible to give it back in my lifetime to you people. But the biggest gift, and then I'll close because I know you guys want to get home. The biggest gift that I remember people saying, I was there when my parents passed away, and I was able to help them with that. And, I always said, I understand that. I understand what I'd put my mom through. And she says when I was in prison, she cried the blue out of her eyes. And the last several years of her life, she was clear as a bell. She lived in a facility right down the road from me. I talked to my mother every single day. And the biggest amends, I went in there and made amends with her. All she said is she wanted to spend time with me. I'd stolen from my mother, right? I'd stolen that time, the peace of mind. I was a thief. And so I go in there, and the last 2 years ago, she started taking a turn. When MS takes a turn, it goes pretty quick. And so she was communicating for a while. She stopped eating as much, and I'd go in there, and she wouldn't drink water sometimes, and I'd tap her, like, Mom, hey, you're going to drink this. And the nurse is like, I'm like, she's drinking, right? Like, they're like, well, we can't get away with you smacking a straw upside your mom's head, right? But every time I would go in there, my mom, to the last days where she couldn't communicate, my mom would smile, right? And one of the biggest gifts, the biggest amends that I ever made is I could go in there and I could make my mom laugh every single time. And up until the day she passed, when I said, Mom, it's me, and she wouldn't communicate with anybody else and she wasn't talking, she would smile to the very last day. And I'd read to her, and we talk about that gift, and I never had an idea of how big of a gift it was to be there for my mom up until our final days. And I would read to her, and we'd listen to music, and we'd listen to old country, and I'd just sit there with her. And I read through this book, and it was, I'll say who it is, Willie Nelson. He's not AA approved, but I'm going to read a little of him because he talks about God and he talks about a spirit. And Chuck C. used to say, God is love, and that's what I believe. And it was love that brought me into this world, and I was there for my mom when she went out. And I'd skipped around this story. It was called Letters to America, and I'd skipped around it several times. And let me find it here. Because I thought he was joking, right? It says God is a 4-letter word. And this is what I read to my mom, and then she passed. And I know she knew I was safe. It says God is a 4-letter word. No matter your religion, you likely have your own idea of what God is. Some think of God as that big guy in the sky who makes all the decisions for us. Some say God is a woman. Some say God is dead. Some say God never was. My view is simple. I believe that God is love, period. End of story. For love runs through everyone and everything. Every one of us loves the flowers, and the flowers love the rain. If you love the ocean, you know the ocean lives and loves to caress the shore. Love is the thing we all have in common. We ache for love. We hope for love. We love and like to be loved, and that's God. Take these words of wisdom with you everywhere you go, and tell all the religions of the world, and through them the truth shall flow. But God is love, and love is God. That's all you need to know. And he goes on to write a letter to God, and I won't read the whole thing, but the part that hit me when I read it the next day was, the universe in which we're born is infinitely large, and each of us is so small. We search for meaning when the meaning is all around us. In every moment of our day, we search for you, God. We always have. We try to give you a form that we can understand. You've always been with me in all of your many forms. I started in a Methodist church, but found myself at ease with every religion I've tried to understand. I can't tell you now whether I'm Baptist or Buddhist. Considering my footwear, maybe I'm just a Buddhist, a boot-wearing man who believes we were put here for a reason, and that by doing our best, we may find the light we seek. If not, our souls are eternal, and perhaps next time around, we'll do better. You spoke to me in the church, and you spoke to me in the fields and in the open pastures. You spoke to me in the songs of the mockingbirds and blue jays who flow above us. You spoke to me through the rustle of the Texas wind in the trees and through the thunder in the night. And when I paused to listen, you still speak to me. You spoke to me through the music and the guidance from my mother, who told me God always prevails because good and goodness can never be defeated. I wrote a song for you once called In God's Eyes, but maybe I wrote all of those songs for you, just as all of these songs were gifts from you. You were with me at the birth of my children and at the passing of my friends. You were with me when I gaze out on the blue bonnets of Texas. You're with me when the rooster crows at dawn. He doesn't sound sweeter than a mockingbird, but try telling the rooster that. I feel you when I marvel and wonder at the brilliant rainbows of Maui, when I sing in the little frontier chapel in Luck, and when I stop for reflection on a quiet weekday in the Methodist church where my sister and I first lifted our voices to the heavens. The beauty of this world and the power in it have always been with us. You give us a power to see and smell and touch it. We're born of love, and it is love that carries us through. Thank you for giving me a God of my understanding that's carried me through the good times and the bad times. And thank you for my life. Thank you to Alcoholics Anonymous.